Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to all of you who are viewing us via, our channels on YouTube, through Facebook, all over social media. And I want to welcome you, as always, to the Tower at UNN. As always, well wishings, and I hope that all is well and all is within alignment. And if it's not, I hope that it does go into the alignment that you want it to go to, or the tempo that you wish for to go through life. And once again, I want to still welcome you to the Tower at UNN. But before we start today, we're going to do two things prior to starting today. First of all, we're going to play, of course, our national anthem. And then after our national anthem, we're going to play another anthem from Bukedi State. But this will be from the Bagwere chiefdom, because there as well, there's communities other than that, which is the Japadolos are also part of the Bukedi State. So we will go with that anthem for today to welcome us, to ground us, and to keep on talking and looking at the focus of the shows, and the focus of what we do here is for advocacy of federation within Uganda, but also in the light of we have to remember that we live in a globalized world, in the light of the universalism that has been enforced onto us via colonization and the neo-colonial era. And then start to think of ways that we can liberate ourselves and fully participate in self-determination as citizens, not only of the different states we come from, or as different members of our indigenous groups, but also as Africans. So I'm going to ask the producer to go ahead and play the two anthems that I have mentioned, and then we shall pick up the show from there. I'll introduce the show after the anthems.
Oh, Uganda, may God uphold thee. We lay our future in thy hand. United, free, for liberty, together we'll always stand. Uganda, the land of freedom, our love and labor we give, and we've neighbors all at our country's calling, peace and friendship. You
Oh, sorry, I just realized that I had muted myself. So hopefully now I can be heard. So I just wanted to say, I was just saying, welcome back from the anthems. And before we actually start today, I wanted to go through just a little bit of updates on what has been going on in the backdrop. As you know, here we are looking for systematic change in Uganda. And for that systematic change, the recommendation that's on the table is federacy in Uganda, especially federacy that is ingrained, of course, in our indigeneity, and federacy that will allow for self-determination through our indigeneity and allow for federal unity in all these different states that hold very many different indigenous populations in Uganda. So the first update is that in order to get the same, that's why we have the Uganda Federal Consultative Council, which is one that is due to be held. But before it is held, we have to go through procedures. So for a few of the updates, so the UFCC, these are some takeaways from where we stand within our revolutionary process and within the context of the globe. That's going to be the backdrop of the show today, but I wanted to start with some updates. So UFCC Executive Steering Committee, and the key word there is steering, and the chapters around the world. That's an update of a development that is actually happening, whereby there's going to be steering committees, but these are not the stone cold committees. These are just steering committees to get us to where we want. So that's the first update. And then the UFCC management team also extends its gratefulness to all individuals who decided to submit their CVs and resumes for participation in order to join the different committees. So we want to thank everyone who has taken it upon themselves to be a part of the change that we want to see in us. So we're thankful for everyone who submitted their resumes. And then the next one is that we're now at the next stage, whereby the executive assessment team has finished the initial process, and that was the phase of going through and assessing all CVs. And then now we'll soon be dispatching the second round or the second stage of the assessment process, and that communication is happening via email. So in case you did send your resume, you'll be hearing back and getting further directions of actions that you need to take in order to continue being within the process. And also, please be reminded that these are that we need long-term strategies, because this is a long-term plan. for our longevity, for the longevity of the peace we seek. And also we need planners, political, economic, and social and constitutional architects. Also is one thing that we're looking at, because most of the things that we're looking at is, of course, nation building, but not only within our small little field, but within the region as a whole. So anyone qualified within all those avenues, or anyone looking for revolutionary change in all those avenues and has some ideas. And also from what is happening in the world, or what we have now happening globally. And yes, I'm going to talk a little bit, today's show, I'm going to talk about the Ukraine-Russian crisis, but I also want us to really tune into, when we talk about the world, why do we microscope it so small to what's happening in the Western world? And we fail to ignore that even on Wednesday, when everything was going on between Ukraine and Russia, the US actually bombed Somalia, which is next door to us, but you would not hear anything about that. And Somalia has been a target for USA mercenaries, bombing in the name of looking for Al-Shabaab or Al-Shabaab individuals, but end up killing civilians. This also happened within the bigger scope of what's happening globally with wars. So what can we learn about that? How these Western hegemonic worlds continue to manifest, not only manifest, but campaign for and invest money and resources in war. And also, for any revolution to succeed, we're going to need strategists, tacticians, planners, and revolutionary architects. That remains of fundamental importance. And then lastly, of course, because most of our revolution has been happening within the social media spaces, in our era, we're given this opportunity of communicating swiftly with each other via social media, and we need to drive our agendas, our motives on social media. And that includes all things that do come with social media numbers, keyboard warriors, likes, comments, emojis, and any recent political newcomers who have made you believe in or have legitimate, real solutions for the liberation to occur. So let's not be stuck in digital obsessions, and let's look for ways to actually use things like social media to our benefit, whereby we use it as a tool to drive our interests, the same way as we use it as a tool to drive for justice, to drive for a source of dignity. When things do not go well, let us start to use it like that and drift away from obsessions of social media. In music, there is what they call a one-hit wonder. You produce one song and you become a huge artist, but nothing ever comes out of that. It's the same thing with social media celebrityhood, whereby people just say revolution just for the clout. They call it clout, I guess. Where things are just done for clout or to be known or to be reckoned. So let's start to use social media whereby it's not just one individual being known or reckoned or heard or admired or adored, but let's do it to actually drive the change that we want to see, to be the medium that is. Let's not individualize the social media experience that we're looking for revolutionary change. Let it be merged into our motives. Let it be merged into our goals. Let it be merged into what we're asking for. And may we drive the ideas and ideology on social media so that we meet also more people who are within that vein. So I think those are some of the updates that I had for you today. Hopefully, if people have not been here to see it, please make sure that you do send the message, or you do tell other people of the updates, as things in the backdrop are still unraveling, for Uganda Federal Consultative Council. But this is something that has a lot of time and work and effort has been put into it, and will come to fruition, and that we hope that all Ugandans participate in the forthcoming conference. So you do still have a chance to be a part of it. This is history in the making. register for UFCC conference by visiting, of course, the website, which is www.ufcc.uk. We're only stronger together. That's why in I think I had a tell about in Buganda whereby if you get one stick and you break it, it's breakable. But if you put a bundle of sticks together and tie them with a rubber band, those are harder to break. So together we are stronger. That's why we say umoja to get Ubuntu. So we need to get back to those things about ourselves, beliefs of our ancestors. And also, we are united in the fight against unitary rule. Or by unitary rule, we mean having one person or one group of people hold all power. We believe in power of the people. We believe in the redistribution of power amongst the people, and redistribution of power through also redistribution of resources / means of production to the people. That's why this can only be achieved in an umbrella of togetherness, but also via agreements of unity after we have achieved certain ownership of indigeneity and our lands and come together in federacy. I think those will be the updates for today. Hopefully they've been received and they will be transferred further. So if the producer can go to the next slides. For today, we're going to be looking at what is happening around the world. And today's show talks about the global African in a world of crisis. But world of crisis, we're talking about war. And right now, we're at a point in time or a period in time whereby I want to first clarify that as the world begins to shamble and talk about how war is happening, war has been happening around the world. We can talk about Syria, we can talk about Afghanistan, we can talk about Palestine, we can talk about what happened in Libya in 2011, we can talk about backdoor in Somalia, we can talk about Ethiopia, we can talk about Eritrea. But what is the common factor in all these wars? And what remains the common factor in all these wars is the warmongering that is done by Western hegemonic states in campaigning, investing, and pushing for these wars. So right now, when it happens in Europe, right in their back door, it is important for us to remember our struggle against Western imperialism. And by this, we're referring to countries like the United States, Britain, France, Germany, and we will go further into it, and then we see how this relates to us. But let us not forget that war has been waged on the peoples of Africa by projects such as NATO, projects that are run by NATO, and AFRICOM itself, which was reinstated during Obama's presidency to actually allow for African mercenaries who work for dictators like Museveni to be trained by the US. Kagame got trained by the US, his military tactics, and then they're provided weapons, and then they also provide spaces for such US military bases that come through NATO and the likes of which to build their military, to build bases on the African continent, to allow them to have surveillance elsewhere, to extend their military power via those relationships between puppet leaders and Western, so that their interests are kept in check or in line. So I want to talk about the global African in a world of crisis and what this means to us and what we need to do at this point. Because many of us can look at what's happening in Ukraine via Russia, and I've seen most people, especially online, you find for most Africans it has been like, pray for Ukraine, and guaranteed, yes, no one wants to see war break out elsewhere. But let us not forget how many of our people have died not only in these wars whereby they are financed by these organizations or by these governments, but have also died due to catastrophes such as environmental catastrophes that only happen because of these Western countries' hegemonic desire to actually loot and exploit countries of their resources that is pushing the climate to its max. But also that aside, they actually support presidencies such as Museveni's that lead to the killing of Ugandans, which we saw for ourselves. So, and also people like, now we talk about Museveni's son, Muhoozi, who is being pushed to become president and will be supported by these same countries or institutions, but has not answered for his crimes in Kasese. So let us keep all those things in mind, and keep in mind the idea that what we need to fight is this Western imperialism that creates a hegemonic experience that makes it seem like now we are all against Russia, and the US or the West is the good guys. So we're going to go into that today, and then we will trickle into how this relates to us and our struggle against imperialism. If the producer could please go to the next slide. So sources that are being covered throughout today, these are pretty short and brief. If you Google them, you can have access to them. So I will not promise to post them in the group, because I even forgot to post the ones from last week. That's on me. My apologies. But if you take a screenshot of some of the sources that I do bring here, and then you Google them, you can actually have quick access to them. And if you don't have access to them, my email is on there. You then contact me and I email you a copy. But in that case, I will no longer be promising to actually post them in the group, but I will actually encourage everyone to take a screenshot and then go look at these sources themselves. Some of the ones today are very short and easy to read. So there is one which is Africa's biggest terrorist threat, AFRICOM and NATO. This was written by the Hood Communist blog, and if you just Google this title and put on Hood Communist, you will get actually the link to it. And then the second one, it's a very short read, easy to read and very informative. There is NATO trains and finances neo-Nazis and sorry, that was meant to be and jihadists in Ukraine. This one was written by the Internationalist 360. This was published, in the Internationalist 360, and was written by Mission Verdad. And then the next one, it's about an hour 20 minutes video that came out just 5 days ago. A comrade happened to send it to me, and I find it's very informative, and most of the information I have today I got from there, and also a bunch of other sources, and following this since, of course, the annex of Crimea by Russia. But Professor John Marshimia, The Situation in Russia and Ukraine, it's on a YouTube channel. It's on the King's Politics YouTube channel. And if you Google this, you'll be able to find it. If we can go to the next slide, please. So first of all, we need to come to the acknowledgement that most of these things have been portrayed in Western media. And Western media happens to always create a narrative of the good guys versus the bad guys rhetoric. And this should not come surprising, because this is a form and a system of propaganda that has been used by especially Western countries, especially when we talk about the US. That's why we're living in an era where superhero movies are the norm, where all our children and all our youth to be, and even I myself included, we grew up in a world whereby a very binary world, where you have the good guys and you have the bad guys. And of course, superhero movies are created as that's propaganda. That's propaganda machinery that is put down our throats, so that when situations like this happen, without even thinking about it, already Russia was the bad guys, and the Western nations in the US and its allies were already seen as the good guys who are going against Russia and Putin, who is evil and just wants and is racist and wants to. That's the rhetoric that was being built up and pushed on the internet. But then the question is this actually even true? Is this the truth behind the story? Because the irony is that when Russia was USSR and NATO was put in place to get rid of USSR, of which USSR fell because when the United States invaded Afghanistan, where they spent 20 years and just left last year, and now are actually putting sanctions on the Afghani government, and which is leading to a lot of hunger and killing of the people. Because as a revolutionary, the ability of a country to put for another country to put major sanctions on a nation that will affect the people of that nation is taboo. We do not advocate for a country having the power to put sanctions that will cripple a nation's economy and a nation's ability to build itself. But we need to go back in the history. So USSR existed. We're looking at a time of the Cold War, where USSR was a combination of many Eastern Bloc nations that came together within the band of communism. But then you have the Western hegemonic states. They've just come out of colonization. They've just come out of colonization, and they still want to keep their interests. So USSR was a threat because you had a lot of African countries moving towards socialist endeavors, a social government, a government that cares more about the welfare of the people than profit and money making, creating for use and not creating for profit. That was a problem. And not only was it happening in Africa, but it was happening in Latin America, and it was happening in places in the Middle East. So that is why when a government was elected by the people, a government that leaned more towards the left or the well, or in politics, they'll tell you leans more towards the left, away from the liberal medium and more towards the left, which was towards USSR in Afghanistan. When the people of when Afghanis actually voted for a government that wished for that, what happened was the US started to actively finance the people in Afghanistan who did not agree, the minority group that did not agree with the government, which always happens to be, of course, the few rich people who do not want to be in a government where resources are put back towards the people's development and not towards profit making, decided to fund them. And then that led to the 20-year-old war that has been happening in Afghanistan. And then recently, when Afghanis were able to take back their country, what does the US do? The US and its allies, they put heavy sanctions on the nation. That is actually causing a lot of not only economic, but resource problems in Afghanistan. So this ability of the US to be able to create the good guys and the bad guys, because some nations do not agree on how they should treat their populations and peoples, is something that has been happening over time. It's not something new. It's a tool that has been used by in very many different scenarios. That was just an example from Afghanistan. But then how does this all relate to Russia right now? So the NATO is formed to make sure that USSR is disbanded. USSR fell due to the invasion that happened in Afghanistan in the 90s. USSR becomes disbanded, and then there we enter the phase of whereby USSR, which was a communist bloc, ceases to even be a communist bloc, because Russia itself, there is a misinterpretation that I see online where people have the understanding that, oh, Russia is communist against US, which is capitalist. Russia is not even a communist state. Russia is not, its economy does not run on communist bounds like we see China. Russia stopped being a communist state. And actually, most of its things, Russia is within the vein of capitalism. So if you compare it economically to the US, it's just a rising strong bloc within the same system of economics. So how does it happen whereby Russia is created to be the bad guys and the Western hegemonic nations become the good guys? How does this rhetoric get created? But then the question, that should not be the main question. The main question should be, so what is the truth behind, or what is behind this rhetoric? If the producer could please go to the next slide. So who is responsible for what we all just witnessed this week? And the answer to this is, if you do your research, is very clear as broad daylight. It is the US and its allies behind the band of NATO. So why is it that I do say this? If the producer could please go to the next slide. So it's important to first start to understand who is the US's allies. And why is this so? I think in an episode before, we talked about how after colonization the US was on the rise, and what happened was collective colonization, which allowed for US to be the front of imperialism, and all these other countries will just rally behind the US. So you have on this map, you'll see strong but critic partners. You see those regions that are marked with the yellow and it's striped through. You're looking at Western Europe. And then you'll see new partners. You see around Russia right now, because here you have the Russian Federation, which is Russia and other countries. So other countries can join Russia within Federation or other communities. Because as I've said before, USSR was an Eastern bloc that used to stretch this whole Eastern center, and it was countries around here that were in Federation in the USSR. When the USSR was banned, but was broken down, you remained with Russia, but different states or communities or indigenous communities around still felt like they're linked to Russia and would join within Russian Federacy. So here where you see the purple, you have those new, and I'm going to talk about those new partners to the US. And then you have the hostile but useful subject right here in Venezuela. And in Venezuela, what happened is the people actually voted for the Venezuelan president, but what happened, the US wanted to support another person to come and overthrow, because of course of the oil resources that are in Venezuela, to overthrow that government, because a more leaning left government that is people-centered and focuses on the resources to be redistributed amongst the people does not benefit the capitalistic model that actually stands for businesses. And then you will see, of course, the yellow ones, those are the strong partners. And then in Africa, you have the unreliable partners in green. And there, it's interesting to see nations such as, of course, you have Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Morocco, and then you have nations like Libya. This should not be surprising as well. And then the other parts are not marked out because that's considered territory where the US does have its reach anyway. So if we could go to the next slide. So what is the history of this crisis? So in 2008, the NATO, oh, sorry, if we can go to the previous slide. Actually, I wanted to talk about NATO. So in 2008, NATO wanted to turn Ukraine into a Western ally, and Ukraine lies on the Russian border. So what happened was, the idea was to expand NATO eastward to include Ukraine, and this was the most important thing. And then European Union expansion was also included in that, and also the color revolution. And for Ukraine, the color was orange in that case, which meant that Ukraine was to turn into a liberal democratic state, like within the same vein of politics in the US, like the Western countries. If we could please go to the next slide. So in 2008, where did this all happen? This happened in the Bucharest summit, whereby NATO announced that Georgia and Ukraine would become part of NATO. So Russia opposed that this happens and drew a line that Ukraine joining NATO was unnegotiable. And this is because Ukraine is right at the border of Russia. And if you know your history very well, there is even a clause that, I've forgotten the name of the clause, but in the US, if you remember if you remember the Cuban Missiles Crisis, which was in 1962, whereby USSR sent missiles to Cuba, and the US felt threatened and at risk, and said this actually went against the clause that you cannot have a strong world power put its ammunitions next to another strong world state that they're not in agreement with. So also Russia was within right to tell the world, especially the Western world, that you cannot bring and start financing and supporting and putting strong ammunition next to us when you are a strong world power that you are, and also us, we are a rising world power that we are, and expect us to feel calm in this situation. So Russia opposed to Ukraine and Georgia joining. And then what happened was, what had even happened before this was NATO had already begun to expand east. And as I said before, for USSR to break apart, NATO or the US, NATO and NATO is a combination of all those countries that we talk about, the US, France, Germany, the UK. It had already played a huge role in breaking apart USSR, and also and breaking it apart. So in 1999, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, all nations that used to be part of USSR's federation joined NATO, and Russia was like, okay. In 2004, Romania and the Baltic states also joined NATO, and Russia was like, that's okay. But then when in 2008, they wanted Ukraine and Georgia to join, this is where Russia drew the line and said that is just a living threat next door. And if we remember in 1960s, and I think it was 1962, if I'm not getting my numbers wrong, 1962 or 66, sorry, that is when the Cuban missile crisis happened. It was 1962, yes, I should have gone with intuition. When the Cuban Missile Crisis happened in 1962, and this escalated very heavily, and such actions are seen as a threat to the nation, regardless of if you're sending those weapons or armament for defense. It depends, it can be interpreted as offense. So right after that, of course, there was a war between Russia and Georgia. They fought for a while, but then you also have the taking away of the region called Crimea. Because the problem is that if Ukraine would join NATO, this is why Russia had to take away Crimea, because it has a military base in Crimea. So NATO would have the rights to that military base. It's the same thing with Africa and AFRICOM. When we join these agreements with AFRICOM, we give out strategic parts of our continent to these nations to actually build surveillance and build military bases for themselves or for their interests. So Russia did not want the US extending its interests close to home. That's why after the 2008 Bolshevik summit, Russia was like, this is unacceptable. We draw the line there. There is no way that Ukraine, which is our next door neighbor, by our border, also understanding that when the USSR broke apart, there are parts and populations of people in Ukraine that are Russian. So it's the same idea whereby on let me say Mountain Elgon area, we have Ugandans on this side, indigenous communities, but there is also parts of those indigenous communities across the border in Kenya. It's the same situation that happened. If I can go to the next slide, please. So this all escalates in 2014 when there is a coup in Ukraine. So what happened is the US, of course, and NATO played a huge role in overthrowing and reinstating the now neo-Nazi Ukrainian government. So what happens is a pro-Russian president is taken out of power, and a US and Western hegemonic president is put into power. So US and NATO's financing of paramilitary groups and mercenary military, and it's to extend the doctrine, has not only been done in this situation, but has been done in West Asia, in Latin America, and in Africa for many years. With Africa, there are way too many examples to give. We have Dr. Kwame Nkrumah in 1966 being pushed out of Ghana, supported by the help of the CIA and these surveillance intelligences to push him out of power. We have what happened with Thomas Sankara as well, being pushed out of power. We have what happened with Patrice Lumumba, killed immediately, and then they reinstate a new presidency. So the programming or the idea to put in a government that actually supports their interests is something that has been done time and again. So in 2014, a coup happens in Ukraine whereby they reinstate a pro-US government to take charge, and then they get rid of the previous government that just wanted to keep peace with Russia. And then what escalates this, you have the Turks starting to supply drones to Ukraine. And then in 2014, after the coup happens, the US and the West actually starts to even give this government money, financing money for its military activities. And then if we go into the next slide, please. So this is called the ASVOG Battalion, and the ASVOG Battalion has been recognized, and we all know and is clear about it, of having it publicizes, and this is a picture taken of them. This is a battalion that has been supported and financed by NATO in the new government that has been elected. It's known for its neo-Nazi beliefs and its drive for so there's one of those articles that I did put up there that I recommend that you read. It talks about how the same thing that almost broke Europe a couple of years ago, which is Nazism and Nazi Germany, and was talked about so badly, happens to be the same thing that now Europe wants to defend, because you have most of these Western countries defending these mercenaries and militaries, and also within compare and contrast it to how we got taught about Hitler. So in general, is to understand the situation that is happening now. We must understand that Russia was pushed, provoked, put against the wall, and pushed into action. But the question we must ask ourselves is, for what benefit? Therefore, we started to generate this whole global narrative of the good guys versus the bad guys, and on whose side are we on. And this is also in the backdrop of people dying, of a war where some people are going to make profit, but other people's lives are never going to be stable, and they're going to lose their lives, or their lives are going to be fundamentally changed. So number one is we have to understand that, yes, there is being anti-war and being against war. But to actually get rid of war itself as a son, we have to be anti-imperialist, and that is very important. And anti-imperialist is the level of being against the supremacy that these Western countries give or attribute to themselves, to actually say what goes and what doesn't go in different nations and territories. And because this happens daily for us Africans, whereby if America doesn't support Museveni, Museveni is not in power. And that is mind-blowing, that we still live in an era whereby countries that are actually going and provoking wars in certain areas still have a say on how a group of people has to be governed. But that also goes to the selfishness of some of our leaders on the African continent, who will actually live they don't mind living by change, just pocket change that is given to them by these nations, and actually suppressing the needs of their people. So we have to start to elevate, or to think about, in order for things like this not to happen, where a war is actually pushed for by certain nations in the name of self-determination, is filled with imperialistic intent in its backdrop, because it always comes back tumbling to us Africans. That's something we also need to keep in mind. It always comes back tumbling back to us. So before we continue, we're first going to take a break, and then we will come back and hopefully do think about that. Let's take a break and then come back.
Bawansolo nga bakuba olukiiko lwabwe okusala entotto engeri gye banaasobola okweggyako omugwira wa mpologoma eyabalumba mu kibira kyabwe neyefuula kabaka waabwe ewatali yadde olukusa okuva gye bali. Wampologoma yajjanga mununuzi okubataasa ku mmese ezaababbiranga ebinyeebwa byabwe, kubanga yabagamba nti ewaabwe gy'asibuka bakugu nnyo mu kutega emmese eza buli kika. Era bo ewaabwe omwana azaalibwa n'akamaso mu ngalo, era eyo yenna alemererwa bamuzaaluka mu kika kyabwe ekyaba Wampologoma. kyokka beerabira okumubuuza emmere gy'alya n'omusala gwe yali yeetaaga. Baalabira awo nga bannaye batandika okubula ku kyalo omu ku omu. Baakizuula luvannyuma nnyo nti Wampologoma ye yali ababwebwena. Baasalawo beekumeekume wamu basala entotto engeri gye banaasobola okweggyako Sirwajja okwoota, okukkakkana nga buli omu afunye obuvunaanyizibwa era nga buli omu afunye n'ekitundu ky'alina okukwata basobole okumegguza Wampologoma. Era baamuwangula nga newankubadde baasooka kumutya kuba Wampologoma yali w'amaanyi nnyo ate ng'atiisa. Uganda Federal Consultative Council lwe lukiiko lwa bannayuganda abasazeewo okwegatta ewamu bateeseza eggwanga lyabwe okusobola okwenunula nga bayita mu nfuga eya federal. Naawe beegatteko. Weeyeza okusabako ku email ya ufcc@getunn.com.
Oh, sorry, I was muted again. I want to welcome you back from the break and back to the topic at hand and what we were talking about. So, number one is the last thing that I said during this program, and something that we ought to think about is number one, there is being anti-war and being against war, but to understand the fight against war means to actually go against the hegemonic Western bloc, because it is that Western bloc that finances war, advocates for war, creates the narrative around war, as we can see in the example of what is happening in Ukraine and Russia. They pushed Russia to its limit, threatened Russia because what we need to understand is if Ukraine was to join NATO, this would mean that Ukraine was a strong ally of the US and the Western Bloc, which means Ukraine can be used to attack Russia. So Russia has all right to be pissed about that. And what Russia actually wanted, and what they wanted to reach an agreement on, was let Ukraine remain a neutral country. Like they say, Switzerland is a neutral country. Russia did not mind something like that. And also, additionally, Russia also asked to join NATO. So we need to actually be anti-war, we need to be anti-imperialist, because it is them who create these weaponries, finance them. We need to know that even in a war, some people are making money, and start thinking about who is actually making all these firearms that people are waving around. They don't fall from the sky. I remember one comedian was making a joke, and he said, and he said, no, it wasn't a comedian. I think this was it was a someone. It's been talked about by different people, but I'll give an example. For example, when you see war footage from different areas, and you see people in the question was, how are we seeing people in t-shirts and khaki shorts and sandals that are run down, but they are holding expensive AK-47? Where are they getting the money to have such ammunition? That is a funded war. So that's why, to be anti-war, we need to be anti-imperialist, which means going against this Western hegemonic empire that promotes the supremacy of Western states. So of a few Western bloc states that have taken the economy and have used the economy to suppress nationhood and self-determination of not only African people, but of a global people. So we need to learn from what's happening now and reorganize ourselves, because we need to organize to go against the system. And we need to know what we're organizing against. Because you cannot wake up and say, oh, I'm anti-war, I'm against war. But to actually fully be against war, you need to go against the head of the war. So while everything is happening in Ukraine at the moment, that's why this show was called The Global African in a World Crisis. Why is happening to Africans in Ukraine? This was something that was very important to look at, because we know you have your international African students or immigrants in Ukraine. So what was happening to them? So as you can see on here, we're going to go through some things that were coming out of reports, because a lot of the Western media made it seem like only white people were being affected by this war in Ukraine. And it also brings you back into that reality of where we stand globally as a people. And unless we organize power on the African continent and organize our states, we can never get the respect and dignity that we are owed. And we cannot go and ask it of someone else, but we owe it to ourselves to actually return that respect and dignity to ourselves, because our ancestors have already set the stepping stones. It's all about our execution. So this was a post from someone online. They said, train to Poland got here. I and other 2 Africans entered first. A few minutes later, the police came in and dragged us down from our cabin. Only Ukrainians are allowed. I don't blame them though, I blame African leaders. And then someone else also posted and said, Poland and the other European nations that border the Ukraine are allowing fleeing Ukrainians, Indians, Arabs, and other nationals to cross the border and take refugees in their country. The only people they are barring are Black Africans, and right now there are hundreds of African students stranded on the Polish border. Worst of all is the fact that Ukrainians themselves are not allowing Africans to board the free trains that they provided for Ukrainians and other nationals to leave the Ukraine and flee to Europe. And then it goes on to say, there are reports that the Ukrainian police got on these free trains and removed the Africans, saying that they had to stay whilst they allowed nationals from all other countries, including India, etc., to proceed. That is how low down the ladder Africans are now. It is so sad, and I am glad that the BBC, sorry, it's a bit small and blurred out, that's why I will go ahead to read it for you all. It goes on to say, it is so sad, and I'm glad that the BBC has reported it. Treating Nigerians and other Africans with such contempt is unacceptable. Do our people not have the right to flee from Russian bombs and carnage too? and save their lives, this is nothing but pure racism and it's evil. Even when they are fighting and people are dying, the Europeans are still denying some people access to their borders simply because of their skin color. How wicked can they be? Where are all the pro-Ukrainian, Nigerian, and African voices now? There was a lot of voice about being anti-war and being pro-Ukraine. But when it came time for Africans to flee from a war and enter other European neighboring countries that were supporting and receiving a lot of refugees from the Ukraine, still the African was considered not a priority. And that is something we need to take from this. Some of you might say, oh, I'm just reading things from people online. How about we watch some actual live real footage video? If I can ask the producer to please play the 3 clips of things that were actually going down with African people trying to leave the Ukraine and get to safety in other European countries, being denied from entering trains, being left at train stations, and on top of that being left in cold places or in cold holding spaces at the border with Poland. We need to understand.
Man, these people left without taking the blacks, man. None of the blacks, man. See. None. Even the black guys that already have kids, they took their kids and their wife and left the niggas behind. Like, everyone is stranded. This is really too bad.
Please don't do this. Don't do this.
Они неправильно делают.
So if you have interest to call his mom, I would like you to please put calls across to the person and disturb them. If you have family members who can get across to them and disturb them.
We're so stranded. We've not eaten, no place to rest. We're just here. And like we just left the cold outside for like 6 hours. We've been outside. We've been begging, pushing, dragging. Like it's been so traumatic just trying to get into the border and we're not able to get there. Since morning we've been told that all Nigerians, the embassy has gotten buses for us and stuff, but we've not seen any. And then like we watch other nationalities leave and it's really, really so sad. Like people have been crying, people fainted. It's really horrible. Please, Nigeria, please come to our aid.
And we ought to remember that these are not isolated patterns. These are patterns that we saw happen with the global pandemic, whereby everyone else was prioritized other than the Africans. And when Corona wasn't hitting the African continent as hard as it was hitting everywhere, they had the audacity to ask the question, why isn't Corona hitting Africa? But also Africans had been left behind to die. So we need to start to understand that not only Africans who we consider from the African continent, but also the African diaspora, we all have nowhere to go other than Africa. And if we lose Africa, we actually remain the same way how we're treated and have always been treated, aliens on this earth. That is our home. And what do you do with your home? You keep it safe, you defend it. And right now, we are fighting so hard with the enemy within. So for the next slide, the question was, what's the biggest terror in Africa? We get told about Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, but actually the biggest threat to Africa is Western hegemonic imperialism, because this is a statement from a US general known by the name Linda. And he said, Africa is the battleground of the future. They are preparing to wage all their wars. As we now see what's happening, how Ukraine has been used as a battlefield to attack Russia. They are planning to wage all their wars of world domination from the African continent. And this is something that has been put into practice, where you have drones being made on the African continent. You have AFRICOM being stated on the African continent. And who has let this happen? Our useless leaders, our useless politicians who do not talk about these things, who confuse us in ideas and in ways to liberate ourselves, but will not talk about our biggest threat, which is the empire that we are up against. They will romanticize change like change is something we can get the next day without even giving us strategies of how we can actually fight against the empire. Those are the enemies within that we need to actually start to put out in broad daylight and start to actually attack the empire head on strong. And that can only be done not only on Uganda's level through a federacy amongst ourselves, but on a federation of African states and an economic change on the African continent to get all those means of production and put them back in the people's hands, to put them back on the people, in the indigenous people's hands who are on that territory. Now more than ever, we need to go back to that kind of politics. But we're being taken for a fool and taken for rides about a romantic change that will just fall just because we put a different person or a different face to the leadership, while the empire itself has already established partnership with these leaders, these so-called leaders. Where does that leave us? And when their dreams are to actually wage war from the African continent, and how easily Africans are being left to die and not given a right to actually flee to safety or access to flee to safety. If we can't be safe at home, we already are not safe at home. Somalia gives an example of that. Libya gives an example of that. Ethiopia gives an example of that. If the producer could please go to the next slide. Congo gives an example of that. Rwanda gave an example of that, where the US participated behind closed doors in the genocide, not only the genocide that happened in Rwanda itself, but also the killings that happened against the Hutus in the Congo. So now we need to talk about actually kicking NATO and AFRICOM out of Africa, collaboratively, not only done by the Africans on the African continent, but coming together as Africans in the diaspora and Africans in the African continent to actually actively organize to push NATO and AFRICOM out of Africa. We cannot live again in this century being colonized, because we're lying to ourselves if you think that independence and that celebration of independence every October means anything other than foolery. It's tomfoolery, because we're not independent states. Over 38 African states train with AFRICOM. Uganda is included in this. They are trained by US military and militia. Already we've seen what happened in Mali, where the Malian people wanted change and they actually had reached that level of change. But what happens? France starts to finance militaries that have been trained by AFRICOM, and they start to fight the new government. And over time, that's overthrown and they take over the rhetoric of what's happening in Mali. These states pave way. These states that actually are training with AFRICOM, such as Uganda, Burkina Faso, I've forgotten, they're about 38. All of them pave way for the high-tech assassins from AFRICOM to operate some aspects such as drone bases. I've talked about that. Drones are actually things that have been pushed into the world. You see a drone, you think it's taking photos or it's used for that. That was just done to mask us and actually for us to think about it like that. But drones are weapons. On those same drones that you see people flying around taking pictures, those are the same drones whereby bombs and guns are equipped on those drones to actually not only surveil people from above. I know if you've seen Eye in the Sky, those drones are equipped with weaponry to actually bomb places up, and they have been used. And even before the end of Obama's presidency, they used not to record how many people were dying from drone attacks. And drone attacks is just it's like someone playing a video game. They don't even have to be on the war zone. They can kill you from anywhere. And it was people who were doing this in the American army who came up and said, this is not right. But what happens? They end up being punished and put behind bars. And during Obama's presidency, after it, is when they decided to actually start recording the number of people who are being attacked by drones and being killed by drone attacks. But before, there was no record to show for it. So you have drone bases being established on the African continent. This is where they make their drones. Surveillance posts, I've talked about that. You have forward staging areas. How many places on the African continent have US military bases? We cannot even use Ginger Airport because it's a US military base. It's ridiculous. And we have almost to nothing for a military, but the SFC, I think is it called? We just have Museveni's personal bodyguards at this point. We have no retaliation to defend ourselves as a nation, but Museveni's personal bodyguards, a few retired generals who are still looking for a political career, and then a few exaggerated askaris, like once was said by Council Semakade. Like, that is all we have left. But all the other strong military equipment and personnel are just military bases for the US. Why? Why are we fighting US wars when we have our own problems? Why isn't this being talked about and brought to daylight? Why aren't our people being told the truth about, if you want to defend the land, you cannot be fighting for someone else's interests? So and it's the same NATO that now we're providing for and giving space to come and do all these things through AFRICOM that actually was against our own national liberation when people were fighting for independence. It's the same one these are the same organizations that played a huge and major role into removing of presidents who actually wanted to look at the interests of the people. As I said, I always will speak of President Patrice Lumumba because he was killed for phrases such as, I want to do what's right for my people. The Congolese resources should be for the benefit of the Congolese people. And now these are the same organizations that these clownery leaders, I know it's very funny that Museveni calls our indigenous leaders clowns for wearing, he once said in a video, he called them clowns for wearing all that traditional wear. But his mentality is clown work. He's a jokester. And not only, but it's greed that cannot be explained, whereby you sell out people just for your mere benefit, and even your resources are not guaranteed because you're replaceable to these people. So we need to start to think of all these things. And all the people who also wait in line to replace Museveni and be the ones to hold the banderas for these nations are forgetting one but big major thing. You can never be them and only work for them, and you are replaceable. And you will never be able to serve the nation. So that's why we come here and we tell you, because we should know this in order to see those leaders and say, you know what, you're not going to lead me to my liberation. We should be able to know the difference off the bat from what they say, but most importantly, from their actions. If we could go to the next slide, please. Producer. Or I think in general that was the last slide. But the whole idea of this is, now I think we get to see the war we get to see the battle in its fullest, the bigger picture. But what some takeaways from this, like what I always take away is, number one, we're not alone in this thing. We're not alone in it as, Buganda state or Bunyoro state. First of all, we have that federacy that we strive for as Ugandans. But we're not alone in terms of we have a huge African diaspora, and we have our African continent as well. When we join hands and we start to organize and draw strategies based off of our unity and collaboration for our safety and the return of our dignity against Western imperialism, if we're actually very serious about being anti-imperialists, we must rid ourselves of these systems of governance that were left behind in the post-colonial era. We must fully decolonize by going back because you can never physically go back, but by calling back our indigenous roots, reinstating them and allowing for our self-governance through that. But we must not also be naive to the idea that we don't need each other. We need to unify, and we can unify under federacy. So that's all I had for today. I wanted us to look at what's happening. And also it's important to know that how the issue has been covered in Ukraine versus Russia is not the same way how it's covered when it's Africa's case. Somalia is bombed all the time off of the belief that they are fighting Al-Shabaab, but day-to-day people are dying. That doesn't get recorded, that doesn't get talked about, but it's talked about as a by the way. You don't see it on headlines, like you don't see people saying we need to come together and, fight for togetherness against this war. It is seen as a just war, but it's actually killing our own people. And it could be Uganda, it could be any next state where this gets done. But until we understand the fundamentals of fighting imperialism and the hegemony around it, which is one, they control the media, and the narrative that they feed you is wrong and you ought to do your research. Number two, to actually be anti-war, we must be anti-imperialist and remove all imperialism, because it is that imperialism that is funding war. I want us to actually understand that. Museveni cannot be a successful warmonger without the support of the US. Museveni cannot afford, like when Museveni went to fight in the bush with 27 people, if you go back and do your research on the war that they staged in Luwero, people were surprised to go, and these people had no ammunition. These people could not afford ammunition. These people had nothing. And even just the uniforms, torn down uniforms. People were surprised. People expected to find they have guns, they have uniforms and Russian food. That's because Museveni had portrayed himself as a Marxist-Leninist, which he's not. He was not supported in that war by Russia, and that's why the US loves him, because he's actually not, because the US would not have supported a Marxist-Leninist, because they were against USSR in the 80s. So we need to start to understand that if we truly want to be anti-war, because I hear so many people, you're anti-war, but to really be anti-war, we need to be anti-imperialism, because it is if you go and look at the maps of all the wars that have been fought in the last centuries, most of them have been in Europe. These folks don't get tired of fighting. All the 2 world wars had nothing to do with Africans, but you had Africans dying. And those were wars that were amongst Europe. The First World War, that was all war for territory on the African continent. Second World War, still war that was fought for territory and resources. So to really stop having these wars and to have peace, we need to actually produce the punching, or what they call the silver bullet against Western imperialism, which is a federacy of African states and the return of means of production to African peoples. That is the only way that we can change the geopolitical. So I want to thank everyone who was with me today. From where we started till now, I want to wish you a good rest of your day. Akume atakumira mpeera.